Hi guys, let's talk about your next paper. This paper is comparison contrast, and this is found in chapter 10 in your textbook. So we're jumping around a little bit in the order that they put the papers, but I think this one logically makes more sense to put it here. So this paper, the idea of this one is analyzing how things are like and also how they're different. So that's where you get compare and contrast. So a lot of times you'll see questions on an assignment that asks for differences or similarities between two items, or sometimes it will ask you to show advantages and disadvantages, which is a type of compare contrast paper. But the biggest key that you're being asked to write compare contrast is when you see something asking about differences and similarities. Okay, so anytime you see those words, that's a big clue that you're being asked to write compare contrast. Or when you're asked simply to compare or to contrast. So anytime you see a writing assignment that has those words in it, this is the type of paper you're being asked to do. Now, you might have already done a paper like this before. We do this a lot in literature when we're comparing and contrasting two different types of characters. We do this in history as well when we talk about different time periods, how they're alike, how they're different, maybe how they approach women's rights or any sort of social issue. So it's not that uncommon to see these types of writing in some of your other, to have seen some of these before in some of your academic areas. Okay. So here's what you need to know specifically about the paper. If you need some ideas for what to write about, here are some ideas. You can write about an experience that was different than what you expected. So what you're comparing and contrasting is your expectation versus the reality of something. So I've given some examples here: a job or a relationship. Maybe you had a certain expectation and things turned out to be different than what you thought. So there's a great area of compare contrast. Of course, generational conflicts or anything that is cross-generational makes for a great compare contrast. So maybe something that's happened between your grandparents and yourself. The greater the distance in the ages, the stronger that you get contrast in the paper, because you have a lot of differences when there's greater differences in age as well. All right, so this would also be a great place to include some narrative about your grandparents and about yourself that would show these particular differences. Another idea is to compare your writing process with what the experts say is the right type of process. So, do you follow what the experts say is the correct writing process? So you can check out the beginning chapters of the book where it talks about the writing process, or go back to your notes and make some compare and contrast there. This one's another great one. Anything about technology is a great compare contrast. The example I'm giving here is the difference between shows of the past with shows of today. And so what there could be something, maybe what does this say about society? And of course, the greatest compare contrast of all time is any of the differences between men and women. So that's a great topic to consider. You need to keep this very specific though, and I don't need anything about the anatomy of men and women. I think we all understand that one. Okay, so I don't want you to go there. But this could be between men and women today, or you could compare a particular gender across time. So you could mix gender and time period. So, men from 20 years ago versus today, or 50 years ago versus today. And then, of course, what do we learn from this? Please remember you need some kind of so what. What are we supposed to learn from this? And it's not that there are similarities and differences. That's not a so what. Because there are similarities and differences, what are we supposed to learn? What are we supposed to learn about our society or about ourselves? Especially for the first one about where you have an expectation versus the reality, then what does that tell you about yourself that you had that expectation and it wasn't met? So don't forget that so what, and the so what again is not these are the likenesses and differences. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some tips for writing this paper. So once you come up with a topic, you need to basically pick two items or two things that you can compare and contrast. Okay. But be sure that you, and I love this little quote from the text, beware what you compare. Okay, the subjects need to be somewhat related because otherwise you have nothing to compare with. And I'm asking you to do both. So that comes to my second point here. You need to contrast and compare in your paper. So you do have to have both of those going on in your paper. So make sure that that's happening. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we look at organization. But beware what you compare. You do need to choose things that have some similarities. So going back up here to the top, if we're going to talk about shows of the past and shows of today, if you're going to choose Mr. Rogers, you would not choose then Desperate Housewives for today, because those are way too different. If you're going to talk about Mr. Rogers, that was a children's show, then you need to choose another children's show from today. So you could talk about Daniel Tiger or Paw Patrol or Dora or PJ Masks, or you can tell I'm pretty well versed in cartoons, right? So, make sure that they have a lot of similarities as well as differences. So be careful about what you choose. All right. Also, again, be sure that the likenesses and differences prove some kind of point. So what point are you going to make about the fact that they're alike and different? Okay. Also, you need to consider your audience. What is your purpose? Are you convincing us that these are the likenesses and differences, or are you informing us? And please remember that we do already know things. Please do not write this about the difference between dogs and cats. I think we all understand that there are differences between dogs and cats. All right, so let's make this a little more intellectual. Don't talk to us as if we don't know anything, because we do. All right, so be very careful with who your audience is. All right, so the thesis for this particular paper will name the two subjects that you're going to compare contrast and what we're going to learn from a compare contrast. All right, so keep that in mind. That's what we're looking for here, is that we clearly define the two items being compared and contrasted, but also that you give us some kind of so what that belongs in that thesis statement as well. Okay. Just a couple other things to think about. There are two ways that you can organize this paper, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But you can see examples of this on page 342. The biggest thing I want you to keep in mind, though, is you need to have balance. Whatever you talk about with one subject, you need to talk about with the other. It needs to be very fair and balanced on both sides of the items you're comparing and contrasting. Again, we'll talk about that here just a little more in a minute. All right. You also need to make sure that you use strong transitions because you're going to be moving back and forth between these two items. Strong, clear transitions are imperative to making this paper work. So be very careful with your transitions. Also, this isn't on there, but definitely something to think about. You cannot use the word it in this paper because we don't know what it will be. Okay, if we're comparing apples and oranges, we don't know whether the it refers to the apples or to the oranges. So be very, very careful about the words that you're choosing because you need to make sure that you're making yourself clear. All right. There are also examples on page 357 to page 359. This one is about where are you from. It's a great little short example of a compare contrast, so that's beneficial to you. But I will be honest, my personal favorite starts on page 361. It's called Superhero Smackdown, and it's a compare contrast of Marvel versus DC. So if you're into superheroes at all, like my kids are, this is a fabulous example of a really strong compare-contrast paper. So take a look at that one. You can see some really good back and forth that happens, some good transitioning, and there's some good notes that go along with it. So anyway, that's the one I suggest you take a look at. It's a great example. And of course, you should read the whole chapter that comes before it. But as far as the example essays that follow it, that's definitely the one I recommend. My second favorite was the one on page 357. It is shorter, so I will say that. Okay, so let's talk about how you plan for this paper and then how you organize this paper. So let me pull up my notebook here. Anytime you're planning for compare contrast, you need to do, there we go. Sorry, I'm waiting for OneNote to open. Here we go. There we go. All right, so you do probably one that you've done before, and that is typically called the Venn diagram. Okay? So let's say for my Venn diagram, for my two items I'm going to compare Elsie, she's my daughter, and Scott, he's my son. And that's not right. There we go. Okay. So here's how you go about doing this the correct way. Whatever I talk about on one side, I need to make sure that I talk about on the other. That's what I was meaning when I talked about balance earlier. So over here in Elsie, if I'm going to talk about age, she is 6. Okay. Then for Scott, I'm also going to talk about age, and he is 2. All right. Then maybe things that they enjoy. So Elsie loves soccer and superheroes. Those are, big in her life. On the other hand, Scott is all about basketball, and he loves flags. All right, so those are his 2 loves. Okay. And then maybe I could tell you that Elsie's favorite colors are pink and teal, and I'm sure this won't surprise you because of his love of flags. Scott's 2 favorite colors are red and blue. Red, white, and blue. He's a true American boy. And so hopefully you see the idea here. Now, this is a really simplistic compare contrast. These aren't great topics because they're not that deep. I would like you to choose something deeper to compare and contrast. But hopefully you're seeing the idea here. The point is that you want to match across the way so that you have good balance on both sides. Now then, of course, how are they alike? Well, they both love to sing. They both love their family, especially grandmom and granddad, because they both get spoiled by grandmom and granddad, things like that. And so I could go on. All right. Hopefully you see the point here. So this is how you want to plan your paper, is you want to do it something like this. All right, but then you got to figure out how you're going to organize your paper. So here is what you need to understand about that. Again, this is what the book is talking about on page 342. So be sure that you take a look also at page 342 for organization. There are 2 ways to organize this. The first one is by topic. Okay, so we can organize by topic. So we do it like this. I'm going to tell you all about Scott first, and I'm going to tell you about his age and all that entails, and his likenesses, so things that he likes, and I will also tell you his favorite colors. Okay, again, this is really pretty simplistic and very surface. This isn't a great topic, but I'm just trying to get the point across. And then I would tell you about Elsie. Now, remember that balance I was talking about? So what am I going to tell you about under Elsie? Well, I'm going to, again, talk about her age. I'm going to talk about the things she likes and maybe her favorite colors. That's kind of what she likes too, but you get the point. Okay, so that's my topic. All right. Then the other option that I have is to do it by subject. And so here's what that would look like. So I would talk about age, and I would tell you about Scott, and I would tell you about Elsie. Okay? Then I would tell you about the things they like, and I would tell you about Scott, and I would tell you about Elsie. And then I would tell you about their colors, and I would tell you about Scott, and I would tell you about Elsie. What you're doing is covering the same material. It's just how do you want to organize it? Okay, and some of that just depends on what feels more natural to you. If one feels a lot more natural to you than the other, go with that one because it will be easier for you to write the paper. Okay, but also remember that you need to include one way that they're alike, because not only do you need to compare for me, but you also need to contrast. So you may need to add a 4th point that is something that they both like together. All right, so keep in mind that you will also need that. So maybe I could put in here, something, so another activity that they both enjoy is singing, and then I could tell you about that. Each of these then represents a body paragraph. Technically, you could make this one big body paragraph, or you could make these 3 little paragraphs, and then you could make this either one giant paragraph, or again, 3 little paragraphs, okay? And then over here, I could make each of these typically a paragraph, so that gets me 3 body paragraphs, and then maybe this one's a 4th body paragraph, all right? So this up here, doing a good job with this up here, makes this very easy. I highly suggest you spend just a couple minutes, you can see that didn't take me very long, to plan out how you're going to organize this, because you don't want to get confused. And notice up here, if I start with Scott and then go to Elsie, I need to do that every single time. You want this to flow naturally, and you want to be predictable, which you would think you wouldn't want to be. You'd think, oh, here I'll do Scott and then Elsie, and then here I'll do Elsie and then Scott. Don't do that. Readers hate that, okay? Go with the flow, stay with the pattern, make it very predictable. So be very careful with that. And again, make sure that it's very balanced. You don't want to talk, I wouldn't want to talk all about Scott and very little about Elsie, because she would be offended if I did that. So there's some ideas of how to put this together. Again, pick topics that have a lot of depth to them, and this will be really easy to do. Take a look at those example topics that I put in the handout, and hopefully those will help too. If you have any questions, feel free to holler at me.